Next up, with the drought conditions faced by many producers this year, the question may arise of how to handle annual forages standing in the field that may not have grown as much as they would have under preferable conditions. As these drought-stressed forages can contain higher amounts of nitrate that have the potential to lead to toxic impacts on cattle, we turn to Nebraska Extension Beef Systems Specialist Mary Drewnoski to get a few suggestions on what to do with high nitrate forage. Cattle producers who have faced high levels of drought throughout the summer may be dealing with forage that contains higher amounts of nitrate than usual. Unfortunately, the only way to tell if your forage is high in nitrate is to have it tested. And when going through the process of sampling and testing, there are a few key points to keep in mind.
Now, the question becomes, how do I get a sample? And that depends a bit on the situation and what you're trying to accomplish. For instance, if you are trying to decide how you're going to harvest it, and so it's standing in the field, and that might change the decision you're going to make, then we're going to do something a little bit different because we're going to sample in the field. A couple things to think about even with sampling in the field is location matters, because there will be hot spots, theoretically. Places that are sandier or droughtier probably will have higher nitrates, as well as shaded areas will have higher nitrates. Anything that interferes with the plant's ability basically to grow can result in higher nitrates. So dryland corners, for instance, will be much higher in nitrates. So you have to decide then how you're going to sample. Do I want to know the absolute worst case scenario, or do I want to sample kind of a representation of what I think the field is? One of the things to consider there is that, especially if it's corners or if there's large areas that are more droughty than others, they tend to be less mature plants, and that means cattle, if you allow them to graze, will probably go to them first. So sampling them separately and knowing what the maximal risk is kind of makes sense, because otherwise you might lull yourself into thinking things are a little bit easier than they are.
If you have the means to do so, one of your best options would be to ensile your forage. This can greatly decrease the amount of nitrate in your forage. However, if this is the route you choose, moisture levels are going to be critical to your success.
If everything goes well, you end up with a product that has 50% less nitrate than it did. And then you have silage, which means it's fairly easy to be able to feed with other ingredients, so you can dilute it more if you need to, and you can provide grain, for instance, if you need to. So one of the things that you got to remember is that for that 50% reduction to happen, you have to have good fermentation. So moisture is probably the number one thing that I see as a challenge sometimes, especially for people who are making silage out of something they're not normally making silage out of. They tend to either harvest it when it's too wet or too dry. Too wet tends to be the most normal, and we've actually seen in some situations where they harvest it, it's fairly wet, like 20% dry matter, 25% dry matter, actually seeing no benefit on nitrates. So you got to make sure you get the moisture right so you get the good fermentation that you need. The clostridial fermentation with really wet material does not seem to reduce nitrates the same way as the fermentation that we look for when we're getting the lactic acid and the acetic acid. So bottom line, make sure you're targeting that moisture content of 60 to 65%.
If you aren't going to graze, and you don't happen to be set up for silage, another option is harvesting forages for hay. However, as dry material has the ability to release nitrate quickly, there are some challenges involved with this method.
If you provide hay to the cattle, they can consume dry matter very quickly. Each bite has a lot of dry matter in it, so that goes against us. And then oftentimes, because of the way hay is made, you'll have hot spots, right? So you might have a bale that has really high levels because it was in one part of the field where you had one of those conditions that increased nitrates. Or even just a small hot spot that was an area that had high nitrates for some reason. And unfortunately, if you provide a bale-free choice to cattle, they tend to sit at the same spot and eat. That may mean that one cow happens to get a hot spot. So what we suggest is actually, in this case, to set the threshold even lower if I'm going to feed a hay bale-free choice, with the idea that if I'm going to sample, the way I'm going to sample, right, is to get a core sample. It's going to go through a lot of layers, and and supposed to be representative of the whole, which means I may or may not pick up, right, those hot spots. And so we set the threshold lower with the idea that we know some might be higher. But if you were to say grind it and include it into a ration, now we can handle a lot higher concentrations because dilution is the solution, right? So if you can grind it and mix it with other feedstuffs, we can use very high nitrate hays. We just got to get the total diet nitrate concentrations down. And we have energy in the diet. Energy, roomly available energy is key here. So grain is your friend. You know, it only takes 1 to 2 pounds per cow to have a lot of impact if you're feeding something that is lower quality. Hay tends to be lower quality just because we tend to wait to harvest it until we have a lot of yield, which means it's a little bit more mature. And so that kind of works against us as well.